Hey there, welcome to House Talk. On this episode, we're going to be talking emergency escape and rescue openings and why we should not be calling these fire egress windows. And we're also going to be discussing what egress really means and what are the purpose of these escape and rescue openings. And what should we be saying in older houses? For this conversation, we brought in Donnie Hester of North Central Washington Home Inspections and the always insightful Charlie Buell from Charles Buell Home Inspections. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Don.
Yeah. Hey, so I guess the first question we have up here, which is a good one, is I think a lot of us are trained to talk about emergency egress out of a bedroom. So the window that you need a properly sized window in your bedroom is egress. So, but that's not really the right term for this, is it? I'd like to talk a little bit about this.
I'll let Donnie go on this to start.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, I mean, you got to delve into, what is the meaning of this whole requirement, and it gets back into really about emergency response and escape. So it's about how can I get out of a place in an emergency, and more importantly, how can somebody get in and save me in an emergency?
Yeah.
And so that's where the rules really come from, and that's why you don't see egress, because egress is more about just getting out of the building and generally having one that's available to everybody, all occupants, not necessarily in an emergency mode. So the whole emergency escape and rescue is really about how, what happens in one of those events. How do we get out of the building? How somebody get in the building?
Well,
the code wants to make a distinction between normal egress movement through the building and emergency escape that involves rescue or possibly rescue or whatnot. So
that's right. So the reason I've always liked to call it the emergency escape and rescue opening is I remember early on, I would talk about window egress. And of course, you'd be looking at a window that doesn't meet our modern requirements, and the person that you're doing the inspection for says, "Oh, well, I could get out of there." Right? And it's like, well, the egress part of it, you might be able to, but the codes are there so that firemen can get in, right? I mean, so that's where the rescue comes in.
Right. And they have gear that's cumbersome and whatnot. So there are minimum requirements to allow for that, and all the height off the floor, the height off the ground, all of these things are tied to that requirement and defined in the code. So
yeah, and that's why when you the code is 5.7 square feet except on grade level, because what that physical requirement comes now, let alone you have a rescue personnel in their bunker gear and SCBA on and stuff like that. Now you got a ladder involved too.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they need to account for all those things and getting somebody in and out safely.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot more variables with working on the ground. He can throw his gear off and pull it in after him if he wants, which you couldn't do if you're on a ladder.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got a slide coming up. We're going to actually go over just some of the recommended openings and the exceptions for windows that are closer to grade than ones that are above. But I do think the important takeaway, if you're a home inspector anyway, I really think the proper term to use would be an emergency escape and rescue opening when talking about the windows in the bedroom. And I know it's kind of a mouthful, but I really don't think bedroom egress window is really accurate, and I don't think it really kind of provides that logical, as soon as you say emergency escape and rescue opening, people kind of get what that window is for.
That's right.
So I think it's more intuitive. So let's.
Yeah, it changes emphasis of what it means.
That's right. Yeah.
Because people think of just I need to get out versus, let alone do you need to get out, but somebody else may have to get in. If you're down, smoke inhalation or something like that, and then these sizes become kind of important. Can somebody get in a timely manner to get you out? And secondly, can they do it safely so you don't create another issue?
Yep.
Well, I think more often, it'd be interesting to know, but I would guess that these windows get used more for ingress than outgress. How many people actually go out through their window if they're not a teenager?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as a teenager, it could become the primary egress route. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Well, so we've got some exceptions that you put together for us here. So these are kind of important. So basements used only to house mechanical equipment not exceeding a total area of 200 square feet. So if there's not, if you're just sort of I suppose an unfinished basement we could visualize with maybe a water heater and a furnace down there, not necessarily in need of an extra or any way out, right? No door, no window, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dwellings equipped with an automatic sprinkler. So sprinklers are kind of, your get out of jail free card with a lot of this stuff. Once you have a fire suppression system, then emergency escape and rescue not required. So one means of egress, let's see, or two means of egress. Yeah, so you'd have to have one means of egress, but the second one is not required if you have a fire suppression system. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. And that the thing is that EE&R opening could be in another room. It doesn't have to be in that sleeping room if there's a sprinkler system.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So sprinklers kind of game changer. It's interesting. That's yeah, that'd be like your modern house thing. I don't see a ton of sprinkler systems where I am. So,
But you can see this application in condo buildings.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No.
And I see them in certain areas around me where you have developments that are a certain distance from fire rescue.
Yeah.
So they'll require it there.
Yeah. Yeah. The sprinkler system would get required if the fire marshal essentially demanded it when they were planning the development. But that's a nice exception to remember. So you could find yourself in a basement thinking to yourself, boy, this is a new building, and how come the windows don't meet, our normal EE&R, and it would be, so think to yourself, maybe there's a sprinkler system.
Yes,
that would be an
exactly.
exception. So yeah, that's great stuff there, guys. So I think the one that probably most home inspectors have committed to memory is the 5.7 square feet, right? That's kind of your minimum modern code for an escape and rescue opening. But that's when the window is above grade. And you've got this lovely slide here. This is great if you guys are watching on YouTube, but 44 inches is the key when you're both inside the room, but also outside. And I think the logic there makes sense, right? As Charlie was saying earlier, if you don't really need a ladder for a fireman to get in, then it sort of provides a lot more opportunities for people to get in and out, so they can reduce the size.
Yeah, so the key here is that if it's below 44 inches, it can be 5 square feet. If it's above, it's got to be 5.7.
Yep. Great. Yeah, that's a good reminder of that. And here's a good picture of the 5 square foot window when it's at grade. So good visual there if you're watching. And 44 inches, that's our magic number. So Charlie, I think, did you put together this little graph?
I did, yeah.
This is awesome. Maybe we can get a link of it, and we could attach it in the blog if people want to use it. I've seen it. You post this before, and so of course I snagged it. I bring this up occasionally when I'm like, I can't remember. The one that always gets me is I can't remember whether it's 24 wide or 24 high. So I just mix it.
Yeah. Well, this has the minimums for both different sizes and the maximum or minimums, both height and width of each different, whether it's 5 or 5.7. So you can easily, if you've got one dimension, you just plug it in and then you can figure out what the minimum other dimension has to be.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love it. So if you're listening and you're not watching this on YouTube, you can visualize kind of a graph, and he's got the 5.7 square foot in blue and the 5 square foot in green, and it's just a really useful kind of guide to see whether windows meet the minimum requirements for egress. So not a bad thing to kind of have on your computer or something. You can check it when you're out doing an inspection.
I mean, it would be so simple if there wasn't that square foot requirement, because you can have a window that meets the there is three components. It's not as simple as there's a minimum width and a minimum height. It also has to incorporate that square footage requirement.
Yeah, it's got to be all three things, right? It's
Yeah.
minimum.
Correct.
That's right, Donnie?
Yeah,
Yep.
you have to meet the size, and you can get there using one of the other dimensions as long as the other dimension gets you to that size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's got to be 24-inch minimum height or 20-inch minimum width, but they all would have to get either 5 square feet or 5.7 square feet, depending on.
That's right.
Yeah, and this is when we're measuring this, are we talking the whole window, or are we talking like the space that is opened up when one opens the window?
Well, it's the space, the net opening, not
not the window. So
that's where you get into the whole issue with windows that don't have. I hate to throw it out there, but they call it egress hardware. Hopefully someday they'll maybe change that too. But windows, when you order windows, you can order a casement window, for example, whether they'll ask you, well, is this a window for escape and rescue? You got to have egress hardware. Well, it's a holdover from when there wasn't a distinction in the early codes.
Yeah.
Back in the.
And so, did the early codes used to call it an egress window? I mean,
that's a good question. You'd have to. It's certainly not IRC, but that only started in 2000. So I honestly, you'd have to dig into early UBC to see. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, interesting. So, and if you are a homeowner and you're buying windows for your house, it's important to know when you go to the hardware store or a window company and you buy your windows that, in my experience, the windows that meet escape and rescue openings have a sort of color coding to them, so that you can really easily distinguish the ones that are allowed to be in a bedroom versus the ones that are not.
Yeah, you can show the signs of whether the windows were professionally installed in a house, whether the windows, because if you call up a window company, replacement company, they're not going to miss that detail.
That's right. Yeah. If you saw like new windows, even in an old building, and they don't meet code, it does kind of make you wonder a bit about, how comprehensive the contractor was, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you get into retrofit scenarios too, different jurisdictions have different requirements, but all of them will have the same requirement that if you're replacing an existing window that maybe met the requirement, say back in the 70s or the 60s or earlier, you may have a 48 high or 52 high sill or smaller dimensions, you can never reduce the actual opening.
Okay.
So that's which is kind of a critical thing, especially if you got like aluminum windows, where that's the framework of the window is real thin, and now you go get a vinyl window and it's much thicker. You've actually reduced the actual opening, so you may have to change from a slider to a casement to make sure you maintain the minimum opening that was originally there.
Yeah, and
that's a good point.
Yeah, that's going to be hard to know if you're an inspector, but certainly if you're a homeowner, like updating your old windows, it's really the opportunity to try to get to a much safer place. And that, I guess that gets us to, we have a case study up here. So we're looking at a house. Buying a house, you're inspecting a house from the 60s, and it's got these aluminum frames, and the bedrooms have, these small little bits that open up. Some language you could use in your report would be the bedroom windows do not meet current secondary escape and rescue requirements. I recommend in the context of window replacement that the windows meet current requirements as far as practical and be installed by a qualified window installation contractor as a safety upgrade. That's kind of nice language. You could call it an improvement item. You could call it a repair. Yep. These things get a little bit subjective on kind of how much you want to weigh in on these things. It always, to me, this is a great example of that like stew that you kind of mull through as a home inspector. But, I'm partly when I'm looking at these things, I'm thinking, well, are they calling this a bedroom? is this listed as a bedroom? And then, how much upgrading has the house had?
Well, well, and you can get into some aesthetics too. Let's say you have an old house and it's got a 5 foot tall, 30-inch wide window, but it's a 1/3, 2/3.
Yep.
Well, that window is never going to meet the minimum requirements as a 1/3, 2/3. But if you do it as a half and half, 50/50, then you actually meet the requirement, but you change the whole look of the house.
Yep.
So it's kind of an interesting conundrum you can get to when you're actually trying to improve these.
Yep. No, they can be kind of tricky. And I think this is really important stuff to let your client know about, whether, even if you want to call it an improvement item, that's fine, but to at least alerting people. I can't tell you how many times when I've run into this, people seem kind of shocked that, like, oh my God, this, technically isn't a bedroom today. It's like, yeah, it's not. And, you can often find a solution to it, but sometimes it can be pretty cost prohibitive, especially in basements,
Yeah, I think, kind of when, in the context of an inspection too, I always try to, have a discussion with my clients, saying, and find, kind of get some details from them, who's going to be living in the house, and what's the uses of the room going to be? I mean, is it going to be the sewing room? Really, they want to call it a bedroom, but really it's going to be a sewing room. I mean, sort of changes gravity a little bit.
It does. Yeah. It's interesting. I do a lot of pre-listing inspections now, so I don't even know who the client's going to be. And so I'll often use language that's like, if you're going to use this as a bedroom, it ought to meet this requirement. And if you're going to use it, it does. If it's going to be used as an office, it may not matter to you, or so.
Well, and how the building's being sold. Is it being sold as a 4-bedroom house, and it really isn't?
Yep, that's right.
You got.
And it's always sort of funny, right? It gets my hackles up when it's really staged as a bedroom and it's clearly not. That then I'm like, this is a major concern. You can't do this. But meanwhile, they could have staged it as a little yoga room, and I would have been okay with it, right? You'd call it an improvement item.
Well, and oftentimes the appraiser's page will talk about the house and how many bedrooms it has, and it won't agree with the listing. Yeah. The listing will say it's got 4 or 5 bedrooms, and the appraiser's site says 3.
Yeah,
they're counting those 2 rooms in the basement that just don't meet requirements.
That's right. And this is important if you're a home inspector, because the realtors doing the listing often don't understand this stuff, right? So
that's right.
They'll just see a square box of a room and they'll call it another bedroom. So
a lot of people think this is not our purview, but I disagree. I think it is.
Yeah, well,
excuse me. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Donnie.
Well, I was going to say one thing locally I'll see here is that they'll have a home. It'll say, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, 2 unconforming bedrooms.
Yeah. Well, that's at least a little more honest.
No, I think that's a little. At least that's. I think basically giving somebody, here's 2 potential bedrooms, but you got some unconforming components to it.
Yeah.
So I think that's at least pretty straightforward. And I think it gives a realistic opportunity. Yeah, because a lot of people will move in and say, hey, I'm looking to do this, and I get off. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I get asked quite often, about, hey, we want to do this with this room. What do I need to do? And I know there's kind of this whole thing in home inspector world. We're not designers, but a lot of times you can give them guidance, say, well, here's what you need to meet. If you're going to do this is the minimum requirements. And I'm just saying, this is the minimum requirement you need to do. Here's a few ways you can get there. Here's a few different paths. I'm not technically designing, but I am actually just kind of pointing them in the direction. And quite often I'll point them to, some very good literature so they can do their own research, and, and it's not just my opinion, but that's really what it is.
Yeah. Well, and if we don't do it, there's not likely somebody who's going to. And, I kind of think as home inspectors, our job is to help manage client expectations, right? And if they move into the building and they think they're going to have 2 great bedrooms downstairs, and they hire a contractor to do whatever, put in the flooring, and he's the one that is the first person to tell them that they don't have proper emergency escape and rescue openings, then they can get disappointed.
Well, it's kind of interesting because sometimes inspectors that are the first to yell that we're not code inspectors throw out but we are safety inspectors. Well, this certainly falls under that category.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and that's basically all the code is.
Well,
and safety guidelines,
That's right. Yeah.
and here's a good example. I mean, there's a bunch of these 50s homes, and they got fairly tight lot lines between them, and they have the non-conforming bedrooms, and so somebody goes, oh, I can do this, I can turn this into a bedroom if I put it, except now they don't have enough room on that outer wall to even put in a well of proper size.
Yeah, because of the lot lines. Yeah.
Well, quite often there's a driveway there.
Oh, funny. Yeah.
So, which you could still do it, but it's going to be a little more money. You're going to have to engineer, kind of a hatched scenario. It's still doable, but the changes the complexity of getting there.
Yeah, no, that's all important stuff. So we'll talk a little bit. We got bedrooms here. We can use a door for our emergency escape and rescue opening. You guys want to talk a little bit about this? Charlie, you want to say something about this?
Well, it doesn't have to be a window. So if you use a door as your emergency escape and rescue opening, it just has to meet the requirements of a window. It doesn't have to meet the requirements of an egress door. It has to meet the requirements of an escape and rescue window. So it could
opening.
Open. It could be a tiny little doggy door. It's kind of goofing around with it.
In the old house I grew up in, we had a door like this, under the stairs, and it was the Alice in Wonderland door, right? Yeah. No, that's good. You don't see that much, but the point is that for your secondary escape and rescue opening, it doesn't have to be a window. It could have a tiny little door. That would count too.
That's right.
I saw one creative way out, kind of a fully below grade basement, and for their emergency escape and rescue opening, they actually it was a slightly smaller than normal door, but it went into a well. I mean, basically into a shaft with a ladder that you went up, and then you popped up underneath the deck, and you had a unit you would remove from the deck, and
that wouldn't meet legal requirements.
No.
If you can remove that deck without certain knowledge and force.
Yeah, and somebody doesn't put a picnic table on top of it.
That'd be tricky. Well, I would think I would still probably point that out and be like, this, you got to be.
Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so this gets us. I mean, that's actually a good segue to egress. I mean, I think when we started the podcast, we were talking about how people commonly say it's window, emergency egress from your bedroom, and but that's really egress. It is the path of movement through the building. And there's all sorts of language in the building code around your primary egress door, right? And we talk about egress from each floor level, from habitable basements, from habitable attics. Charlie, do you have any thoughts on this for a minute with the?
No, these slides are sort of describing where this egress or path of movement is defined. It has to be from each floor level. That means you've got to have acceptable stairs from attic spaces or second floor levels. A ladder is not going to meet the requirements of a path of egress. That's where you get into these loft situations, which are typically not defined as habitable space if they require a ladder to get to them.
Yep.
But, they can be there and you can use them, but
there's a size requirement or minimum, right? They can't be more than a certain square footage until they need proper egress stairs and stuff that would meet code.
I think that's 200 again.
I think that comes to mind. Yeah.
Well, then you've got headroom and
Yeah.
all these other
Yeah.
requirements.
Yeah, but if the loft is less than 200 square feet, that's when you can have like a fireman's pole or whatever. They don't start defining it. Once you get 200 bigger than 200 square feet, then all the sort of stair codes start coming into place.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I think we're gonna see a lot of change on this one, especially with the tiny house movement.
Hmm.
Mhm.
There's already language coming in to sort of get away, with these full height requirements that we see today for a habitable
Well,
space.
and you see these staggered step stairs that
Yep.
are steeper than normal that are allowed.
Yep.
So
Yeah, as long as it's less than 200 square feet. Yeah. So this gets us to the egress door, and this comes up a lot, but this is kind of interesting. I mean, the one thing that comes up all the time is this idea that you have to have a thumb toggle for the deadbolt, and that is not true of every exterior door. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
yeah, that's the way I read the code. If you read this, it doesn't say egress doors. It says the
Yeah.
the egress door
Yeah.
Yeah.
shall be side hinge, and you can have multiple doors that meet the requirements of an egress door, but there is the primary egress door that the code is talking about. That all your paths of movement through the house have to go to that.
Yeah, that it has to be the required egress door.
Yep.
You
That's
can
right.
have additional openings, that may meet the requirement, but they're not the required opening.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's got to go to a public way. There's 4 or 5 different terms. I think it can go into a yard, but you've got to have access out of that yard.
Well, and
Yep.
Charlie, you're bringing up the stuff that egress Donnie was talking about, where you end up under a deck, probably doesn't.
That's right. That's right. And the code actually defines what that you can
Yep.
come out under a deck, but you've got to
Yep.
have headroom. You got to have
Yep.
a clear path to a public way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. So, but now this is interesting. I remember I'd done an inspection on that. There's a builder near where I am that likes to do these sort of pole barns that are become houses, you know,
Yeah.
mhm.
and some of them only have sliding glass doors, you
Yep.
know,
Yeah,
and I remember thinking like, oh, that's interesting. There's no hinged primary egress door, that doesn't meet code. He obviously was allowed to do it.
it does not. And we have a lot of houses around here that are concrete block houses, and they none of those doors are legal height because they would have had to put in another whole course of blocks
Oh,
all the way
interesting.
around.
So there's short primary
They're all
egress
short.
doors. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, these
yeah.
are so if you're a home inspector listening to this, I mean, you might pick up your code and go back and read some of the stuff about the egress doors. But pretty interesting. You have a the other thing that can come up, and I don't think we have a slide of this, but landings, right? This idea that
Yes.
every door
Mhm.
has to have a landing outside of it. The primary egress door absolutely has to. But I don't think
That's right.
the secondary doors you could open if it opened in and you could take a step down. It doesn't have to have a landing when it's not the
Correct.
primary egress door.
Until you get to 3 risers, then you got to have a landing.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So good stuff. Pretty tricky. I mean, there's all these little exceptions, and here's the height you were talking about, Charlie. So sometimes you might be doing an old building, and it's got a short primary egress door, and I did a house like that just recently, and I pointed that out, and there wasn't a thing you could do about it based on how the whole roof laid out. So it just
That's right.
and I think that's a data point as home inspectors, right? We often find things that just are what they are.
Yep.
You can't fix it, and this is what you're buying. And if it really bugs you, then buy a different house.
Well, and with the building officials too, most of them are pretty aware that these older buildings are going to have some limitations that may not be financially feasible to bring them all the way up to modern requirements, but they'll usually give you an allowance as long as you've improved the safety of the building,
Yeah,
and
interesting.
so they'll tend to work with you to get you to at least a better place,
Yeah.
and kind of give you a little bit of some wiggle room and stuff, you know.
And I guess what Donnie's talking about there is if you're like buying an old place and renovating it, and you're pulling permits and stuff, that, that most building departments will have some leniency and not sort of bring you down that path where everything has to meet modern code.
But again, we're talking about net openings here, because a lot of people think this front door has to be 6'8". Well, actually, it has to be a 6'8" door in order to get the net opening greater than 6'6".
I see. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's much less than 6'8" when you've got the stops at the top and whatnot.
Yeah, interesting. So here we got some slides. If you're listening here, we've got some cool slides about just the net width opening for the door minimum requirement. 3 feet, 33 inches.
So this is a 3.0 door. And you can see that if it opens against a wall perpendicular like that, you only have a net width of about 33 inches.
Yep, so you lose 3 inches,
Yeah, but hit the next, and then it should, but it's greater than the required minimum of 32.
Yeah.
So you can see why a 2'8" door or two. Yeah, is that right? 24. Yeah. At any rate, the next size door down isn't going to necessarily meet it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So just because you have what you think is the right size door, the actual opening could end up being smaller. So, and this would be where you would measure it then, right? We've got a little blue arrow, but we're going from the inside of the door to the other side of the jamb. That's the opening we're dealing with, not the actual size of the door. So that's an important thing.
You have that, whatever the clear opening is.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, here's that slide with if we have a 2'10" door, the net width opening can be 31 inches, which then, it's starting to get
not
small.
compliant.
Yep. Yeah. So good stuff here to think about.
But there is a scenario here where we got a 2'10" door where it does meet.
And that's why it's like a sliding door?
No, it's where it hinges all the way back against the wall.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So it can open all the way. I gotcha. Yeah, because it can't be a slider. Cool. That's neat. Like the slides, Charlie. It's good stuff. So we kind of jumped ahead, but this is a picture of just a sliding glass door. But I think that was our point: is a sliding glass door would generally not meet our primary egress door requirements because it's not a hinged door.
Correct.
Yeah, and in that example, you could even see looks like a 4.0 opening.
Mm-hmm. Huge.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be like it's plenty wide enough, but it still doesn't meet the requirement.
Yep. Yeah. I wonder if that might be certainly for kids and stuff. It can be hard to open a slider.
That's right.
Yeah.
I assume that's the reasoning behind it.
Most of the codes do have some reasoning or logic to them if you think about it and move away from just what you want to do for fun.
Actually, that's my technique for trying to remember codes, frankly. I mean, I'm very story oriented, and so if I can put a story to like why it is the way it is, then I'll never forget it, It's good stuff.
I think a lot of us are that way. I'm kind of the same way. It's like, if I sort of understand the meaning behind it, it kind of changes it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's see, a few more things about egress. Only one door per dwelling unit is required to meet the egress requirements. So we've kind of been through that a bit. And then we've already been through this, that the deadbolt is you could have a keyed deadbolt on a back door as long as it's not a required egress door. And that can be kind of tricky, right? You're doing home inspection. It's not like it's labeled, but I guess my assumption's always been that the entry door, the primary door is the required egress door, and the ones after it are just kind of.
And it's probably a good idea to not do it anyway, but we're talking about what the code requires, not what if you're going to get a builder to fix something, you got to support it with the code.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually try to, I have language, my report, I have some language that is the repair item observation of, they're all keyed, or if it's just the back door or something, I might call it an improvement item, that,
Right.
Well, somebody posted the other day about a deadbolt keyed on both sides to the garage.
mhm.
Yeah, and it's not an egress door. In fact, the door to the garage is specifically not allowed to be part of the path of
Yeah.
egress out of the house. So
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
and I kind of like you, Dylan. I will sort of approach those where I think, that you got a key here, and it just improves the safety if you don't have to worry about grabbing a key and opening the door.
Mhm.
And I kind of will language it, though I'll say it, though not required, I recommend it,
Yeah.
that's how I kind of address that.
Yeah, it's interesting. If
So
it's a glass door, you get people saying, "Oh, they'll break the glass and then they can just unlock it if it's a thumb toggle," and so it's less safe for people breaking
yeah,
into the house.
and you could use that as an argument for other doors other than the egress door to
Hmm.
key both sides if you've got big glass doors, because because the codes are always attempting to balance uh, uh, rescue and security,
Hmm.
and safety and security. They're two different things, and the codes will always fight over those, whether it's NFPA or whether it's IRC. The two of them are always going to balance that, and it's not easy.
Yep.
kind of one of the approaches I use when people kind of say that, I said, I always say, if I want in your house, I'm in your house.
That's right.
Yeah. Well,
And
that's
so,
that's right.
and so I say, really, lock systems keep honest people honest.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
And most
it's
people
like,
don't realize that the most vulnerable part of their house is probably directly through the siding and wall between the studs. It's easier to break all of that than it is glass in a sliding door sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I guess my theory is if you're breaking glass, you're getting in. So,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
yeah. Well, so that's kind of our slides here, but I hope the conversation's helpful. I think we were able to cover some ideas about maybe using proper language when we're talking with clients about emergency escape and rescue openings in our bedrooms, and hopefully that clarifies a little bit too just some of the size requirements that the window is closer than 44 inches to the ground outside, then it only needs to be a five square foot opening. And I think we had some good discussions about just trying to, get our heads around the language here that egress is really a path through and out of a building. And the code has a lot of language around keeping that safe for everybody. And that kind of gets us into all these little nuances of, landings for our doors and thumb toggles for our deadbolts. So trying to get our heads around these things can help clarify a lot of these safety issues for our clients. So. Charlie and Donnie, I really appreciate you putting these slides together. Some really nice stuff. We'll try to get that cool diagram that Charlie has and make that available to people. I'll see if we can figure out how to do that. Guys, have any other final comments here? Escape and rescue openings and egress.
We could talk about it forever and argue about it, and we haven't even gotten to arguing about it yet.
Well, I always tell people, it's like, most people think of these items kind of in a like, oh, hey, I could get out of that, but they don't really think about it. What happens when a real true emergency happens and people panic?
Yep.
And that's when I was a former emergency responder. So kind of these things, when you start thinking about, these rules actually come critical in these times of need.
Yep.
And the reality is most of us don't ever need it. It's kind of like I always use it like the seatbelt. You should put it on every day. You hope you never have to use it for what it's designed for.
Yeah.
It's like, but we want these things to be there in that unfortunate event that your house is on fire, or you got to get your child out, or your grandma or something. It's like then these size requirements have different gravity.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, put aside just for a minute things like that you're 100 years old, or that you weigh twice what you should, or or that you're developmentally disabled or any of these things. How about if you just happen to have a broken leg when it happens? Can you still get out that window? It's
Well, and it probably a nice story to have in your quiver if you're a home inspector is some kind of story to help. You always get this. You point out a safety thing, and the realtor rolls their eyes, and the client says, "Well, is this really a safety hazard?" And I always sort of say something like, if I were to do one home inspection in my life and point all these things out, the odds of that being a safety issue to my client are pretty low. They'll probably make it, but you start doing, well, I mean, statistically, it's not super likely that some of these little things will matter, but you do 5,000 home inspections and it becomes a virtual guarantee that these safety items will affect one of your clients. And
that's right.
That's how we have to think. I mean, we're trying to protect our client base at large, and statistically, if you've done 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 inspections, I pretty much guarantee you've saved somebody from getting hurt, injured, or killed by pointing out safety things. If people listen to you.
And the other kind of approaching that too is like I think we all kind of take a different view on something when somebody that they assume is a professional and say, we point something out, so they go, oh yeah, I didn't think of that, whereas they may just kind of wave it off like, that's not a big deal. But when you start saying, hey, this can happen, and I actually unfortunately have some good stories of where some of these rules actually came. I know somebody who died in a basement that didn't have a proper escape method. It actually does happen. Luckily, it's very rare, but it's like, if it's your loved one, then it changes the gravity again. I mean, it's like, it takes one of those to kind of go, that's probably not a bad idea. Yep.
Stories are incredibly powerful, right? That anecdote makes all these sort of, theoretical codes where you roll your eyes. It brings them all home. It's a really important technique. So anyway, well, I appreciate the conversation, guys. Some great slides, awesome. Interesting stuff on emergency escape and rescue openings. So we'll carry on the conversation another time. But thanks for your time, Charles Buell, and Don Hester. Thanks for coming.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Dylan, for putting us on.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan.
Cheers, guys. Hey, a big thanks to our sponsors today. I want to thank Scribeware Home Inspection Report Software for your efforts to transform the home inspection report writing industry. For Dylan Chalk, the Confident House Hunter, a fabulous resource for home buyers and realtors for getting out in front of the home inspection. And as always, thanks to Dylan Chalk House Talk for hosting this podcast. Thanks for your support.